Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Annika Smith and I'm Director of the Windsor Law Center for Cities and Associate Professor at Windsor Law at the University of Windsor. I'm coming to you today from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi people. As we focus, as we are on this 4-session workshop series on housing, of course, we cannot ignore the fact that the land that we are discussing that there are original inhabitants with claims over the land that we discuss. And although they are not front and foremost in all of our conversations at the moment, to understand the very real and ongoing work of both conservation and inclusion that must be done with respect to the Indigenous peoples of these lands. Thank you for being with us today, all of you, and a very special welcome to our all-star panel of housing experts who are joining us from Windsor, from Toronto. In fact, I think now that I think of it, I'm the only one in Windsor today. But who are joining us virtually for this really important second workshop. I want to also thank, before I go any further, our co-organizers and supporters in this series, the Smart Prosperity Institute at Ottawa University and the University of Ottawa, and the Canadian Urban Institute, who have been amazing partners to us in much of our work over these first couple of years since the Centre for Cities came into existence. I'll take just a moment to tell you a little bit about the Centre for Cities. We're based at Windsor Law at the University of Windsor. We are a center focused on the legal and policy tools of good city building. And by good city building, we take that to mean in particular inclusive and sustainable city building. We work in a very interdisciplinary way, despite being focused or based in the law school. We work both in the local community and with partners across the country on the tools of city building that are so relevant to all of our communities at this moment. And we focus in our work on teaching, research, and community engagement around these issues. So thank you so much for being a part of this session with us. We launched our housing summit in March of this year, along with our organizing partners, which was 2 days where we had a chance to hear in a sort of general sense about some of the very important issues facing us as we collectively face a housing crisis in this country. And one of the things that we heard throughout those 2 days was the importance of digging into some of the weeds on some of these issues, that there were tools available being used in some cases in Canada and elsewhere, but not being used as widely as they could be, and perhaps not understood as well as they might be to be really useful. And so we're committed in this series to digging into those weeds a little bit more. And allowing folks to hear from the experts who actually know what they're talking about and who know this work well. Last week's session, if you didn't join us, was about target market analysis, building the housing that people want and need. And so we looked at the ways in which municipalities can be forward-looking in thinking from a housing systems perspective about the housing that is actually in demand, both in terms of potential target markets, that is not just sort of what has been bought in the past, but also what is going to be in demand now and moving forward. And in particular, thinking about that through a climate lens and an infrastructure cost lens. So understanding that these are big systems pieces, the decisions around what we make, or around what we build rather. That video is available on our YouTube channel, and we hope that you'll have a chance to view that one as well. In the coming weeks, we'll dig into financial incentives, financial tools available to municipalities to help municipalities build more housing and the right housing faster. And then we'll be looking at some planning tools as well and some pre-permitting tools in our last week. This week is a session that we didn't manage to put on during the Housing Summit, and it's one we've been really eager to come to. And I'm so excited to say that we have really industry leaders in this space that are joining us today. We couldn't have chosen, I think, a better panel to have with us to really unpack community land trusts, cooperative housing, and the connection between those two and community housing. This is going to be a fabulous discussion. What we've tried to do throughout this series is to start the workshops with a bit of an overview presentation, so that we all are kind of speaking a common language about what these tools are, and accepting that not everyone is coming here as experts in these areas. In some cases, for some of you joining us today, this will be a repeat of what you already know very well, but it will hopefully again establish sort of a level playing field. And then the second hour, starting at 12:30 today, will be our panel discussion, where some of these folks that you're not going to hear from in the first hour are going to rejoin us. and then engage in a little more of a detailed discussion about what's working and what's not. What are some of the policy tools that we're missing to make some of these things really viable tools to help us address the housing crisis in this country. So I'm going to do introductions just by name at the moment. The full bios will go in the chat, but I don't want to take any more of your time before I turn things over to our panelists. So I'll just introduce according to the order on my screen: James Calderone, Princess Doe, Maureen Coffey, Sam Carter-Shamai, and Chi Tam. Again, I'm thrilled to have you all with us. The bios will be in the chat, as I said. And we're going to jump in. I will just say one last thing by way of introduction before I turn the floor over to Princess and then to James, who are going to lead us through our opening presentations. And that's just a question of how we will proceed from here. The chat will be closed momentarily if it's not already, to all of you in terms of being able to communicate with each other. What we will ask you to do as participants is, if you have questions or comments that you would like everyone to see, please use the Q&A function that's available at the bottom of your screen to do so. Again, that can be for both questions and for comments. The reason for doing that is just to be able to make sure that we're meeting a standard of decency and respect in the comments that are coming through. In this world of Zoom events, we have to be super careful with security. We find that to be the best way to do that. So please do put your comments there. As long as they meet that minimum screen, all comments and questions will be uploaded to the public screen. You'll be able to see them. We may not get to every question. We will do our best, but in the interest of wanting to facilitate that open conversation, that's the way that we'll go forward. So please do throw your questions in when you have a chance, and we'll come to those in about 40 minutes following presentations. With that said, I will turn the floor to Princess and then to James. Again, thanks everyone for being here. And Marlene, Sam, and Chi, we look forward to seeing you in the second hour. Thanks so much. Princess, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my screen, so bear with me. Is everyone able to see that okay? Okay, so I will get started. So once again, thank you so much. As Dr. Smith said, my name is Princess Doe. I am one of the student research associates here with the Center for Cities. I'm just going to minimize this. Perfect. So my background is in community development and working with affordable housing communities, as well as providing direct services with housing insecure individuals, has led me to have an interest in researching different human rights-based approaches to affordable housing. So of course, there are hundreds of community land trusts or CLTs in both the States and Europe, but there's only a handful here in Canada. But there has been increasing attention by housing advocates, governments, and developers to scale up CLTs as one solution out of many for addressing the affordability crisis. So as Dr. Smith mentioned, this presentation will be a little bit more high level, given that there are many people in the audience today who are not too sure about CLTs, haven't heard about them. They're not as widely known here in Canada, particularly outside of the major cities. And so after James's presentation on co-ops, we will get more into detail with our amazing panelists on co-ops, CLTs, community housing, and the opportunities and barriers for the development of this affordable housing.
Princess, I'm going to jump in for 1 second. I'm so sorry. I'm going to jump in for 1 second just to ask if you could click slideshow. We've had a couple of messages that we're not seeing your full screen. If you don't mind just clicking on slideshow, that'd be great.
Okay, sorry, hold on one moment. Let me just see here. Can you see this? Yes, okay.
Yeah, much better. Thank you. Thanks.
Just one question. Sorry for the technical difficulties. If I do this, you can't see it again.
Then we just see the slides on the side as well. If you need to go ahead that way, that's fine, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I'm having a little bit of problems. Okay, I have my notes on the other side, so I'm just trying to see if I can do both and the split share, but I might have to do it that way. Are you still able to see the slides well in this format?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah,
Okay.
I would
So,
say
my apologies for that. My notes are on the other side. I'm having difficulty kind of sharing both. But yeah, if there is anything that I need to clarify along the way that you can't see, then just let me know. So with that, I will go into, you're able to see this, okay? Yeah? All right. So before I jump into how CLTs actually work, I do think it's important to frame why there has been at least a recent push for non-market housing solutions specifically. So this section you see here on the slide is taken from the National Housing Strategy Act, which the federal government passed in 2019. So the act commits the government of Canada to the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing as affirmed under international law. Acknowledging that housing is essential to the inherent dignity, well-being of the person, and for the governments to continue building sustainable and inclusive communities. So I stole a slide from the National Right to Housing Network because I really did like how it presented the different components of what adequate housing actually means under international law and now domestic Canadian law through the National Housing Strategy Act. So I won't go into all of them in much detail, but I did want to bring attention to this because when we are considering the unaffordability of housing, we should be progressing with policy and tools that secures the different components and acknowledge how they may intersect. So today, seeing people who do not have access to safe, habitable housing that fills their needs or that fits their needs in the community of their choice, and that they're often at risk of being flipped or sold or rental prices being inflated, are all some of the main symptoms that we're seeing in today's housing crisis. And so the push to implement safe, secure, and affordable housing as a right and recognize the social determinants of health, or recognize housing as a social determinant of health rather, is a response to the retrenchment of funding and programs across the entire continuum of housing. So I won't go too deeply into the specific history of social housing policy. I know that James will be touching upon this more in detail in his presentation, but it is important again to think about how we got into this crisis in the first place. So very quickly, there was a lot of investment in building all types of housing, including co-ops, for example, during the 60s and 70s and 80s. But as we head into the 90s, this retrenchment of funding and the lack of development of supportive and affordable housing increased wait lists, slowed down builds of apartment rentals, and of course led to a lack of supply across the entire continuum, as well as led to an aging housing stock with a backlog of repairs and maintenance issues. And further, the downloading of responsibility of housing to the municipalities also deeply impacted municipalities' ability to build housing while balancing and addressing other social issues, often that are outside of their core jurisdictions, such as income security. And so as governments attempted to rectify this, the commodification of housing continues to be that elephant in the room in certain housing spaces. So many advocates are pushing for housing solutions that operationalizes housing as a human right, which would remove this problem and secure stable housing options for people wanting to build a home in the community of their choice so that they can build community wealth and other means. And so with that, what is exactly a community land trust, or CLTs? A CLT is a nonprofit corporation that obtains the land, housing, or commercial buildings for the benefit of the community in which it exists in. A CLT centers a human rights-based approach to housing with the goal of removing the land and housing from the traditional real estate market through purchase and donation. So CLTs, like other organizations, are governed by an elected board of directors, which can be comprised of renters, community members, public servants, governments, or other nonprofit organizations. And it is viewed as a tool for widening access to housing, encouraging community participation, and protecting public resources. And so before we get into how they exactly work, I will touch a bit upon a brief history of CLTs in its modern form. And so the first CLT was established by African-American farmers in Georgia during the 1960s, and it's rooted in the Black Civil Rights Movement. So as you can imagine, there were many discriminatory barriers for Black farmers to access and secure land and financing. So by organizing together to create a CLT, they envisioned a place where Black families could affordably access farmland, build farmhouses and barns, and produce crops for local and regional markets. And generally, the goal was to increase the economic economic and political dependency by creating new land tenures through community leases. And so how do CLTs actually work? So in short, in Canada, a CLT must be formed as a nonprofit organization, which then acquires the land and maintains permanent ownership. CLTs then oversee the development of affordable housing or other projects that people can lease their property on, or can lease on CLT property. So a key characteristic of a community land trust is the dual ownership arrangement. So in a classic CLT, a CLT will acquire the land, but they don't typically always acquire structures. Existing or proposed structures on community land trusts are often owned by individual homeowners, co-ops, nonprofit developers of rental housing, or maybe government agencies. As we will see a little later on, both in this presentation and during our overall discussion with our panelists, these organizations that own existing structures can transfer buildings and other assets to CLTs. But in a typical CLT, households can become a member of a community land trust and then buy a long-term lease, such as a 99-year ground lease on a house or property on CLT covered land. And so this legal restriction limits the future profits made from selling the home so that the price can stay manageable. And so when a homeowner sells, they can earn a portion of the increased property sale, and then the rest remains with the trust so that the affordability can remain. And so most CLTs in Canada, given the history of community land trusts, as you can imagine, in Canada, most are community or neighborhood based, which and are often driven by grassroots-led initiatives, such as addressing social issues such as racial disparities, gentrification, and food insecurity. And so as a brief example, out west in Vancouver, there is a Black-led CLT co-op called Hogan's Valley Trust, which developed to address the Black and racialized communities that were displaced in the neighborhood during the 1970s through an urban renewal program. And furthermore, the objectives of CLTs and stewardship also align with Indigenous perspectives and philosophies on the land. And there have been recent funded projects out west and in the territories that are First Nation led, looking to use community land trusts as a model to protect the land and center decolonized forms of governance. So I placed this slide from a report that was done by the University of Toronto School of Cities. I will post a link there after the presentation, as well as other resources, including one that the Center for Cities also wrote about. But I thought this presentation, or this slide rather, was helpful because it does present nicely some of the different both barriers and opportunities for developing CLTs. And while this does say Toronto, I do think that some of these issues are applicable across many municipalities, including smaller ones. So even though I won't go through each one in depth, there are 3 points that I would like to highlight in terms of some of the issues and opportunities for expanding community land trust, which we will also get into more detail with our panelists. So one barrier that many folks involved in community land trusts and affordable housing generally have spoken to is the need for more support and capacity building and bridging that technical expertise in the development and management of CLTs, especially outside of major cities. And so I do know that the Canadian network of community land trusts with other regional partners or other organizations have received funding from CMHC to address this gap with a technical assistance program, which is aiming to kind of support the growth of the CLT sector in Canada. A second issue also that many advocacy groups have pointed to, including the Black Urbanists and Planners Association, is the barriers for accessing financing from traditional banking institutions for alternative developments such as CLTs. So banks are often maybe a little bit more reluctant to provide the necessary capital that's needed to acquire the land. And so once again, looking at the different financial barriers and the financial incentives are important for expanding community land trust, and speaks to how government intervention is often quite necessary. But with government intervention comes a third point, which is that local governments and municipalities have an opportunity to use the tools and regulatory barriers for expanding CLTs and scaling their efforts, and to really act as facilitators for building affordable housing units. And so to exemplify some of the tools, I will use two case examples from Parkdale and Chatham-Kent CLT. But before I conclude with that, I do quickly want to touch upon the difference between affordable housing on CLTs versus social housing. I do know James will also be touching upon this, as well as Marlene, but very quickly, while CLTs can provide affordable housing, they're not often social housing. So social housing are government-owned corporations that have their power through legislation. So in Ontario, this is mainly through the Housing Services Act. So social housing provides below market rental households with low to moderate incomes. Social housing can include nonprofit and co-op housing communities, as well as rent supplement programs found in private market and rural housing owned by the Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services. And so a key difference between CLTs and social housing is the democratic stewardship and control of the land. So as we've seen earlier, CLTs are governed by members of the community. All planning decisions are community-led to fit their needs. And there aren't members or organizations that are part of that community-making process. And so this is particularly important when we think of many underserved populations and disenfranchised populations who have historically not been included in the planning process. And so this model inherently allows for their marginalized voices to be centered more easily. And so to conclude this presentation, I will speak to kind of two case examples of how CLTs have partnered with their municipalities in order to expand their efforts. So I won't go into depth with the actual history of these CLTs, as we do have representatives here. But for the first example, I do have Parkdale, which has been partnering with the City of Toronto and Toronto Community Housing Corporation to identify properties that can be transferred over to the CLT. So I do know just last year alone, the City of Toronto and Toronto CHC announced, I believe, a total of 150 units to Parkdale Community Land Trust, and the Parkdale partnered with the YWCA who will be in charge of the operation and management of those units. And so to provide, lastly, a more local example from Southwestern Ontario, it's really nice to see all this happening near Windsor. And so Brickworks Opportunity Villages in Chatham was developed in August 2020. So Chatham-Kent's municipality partnered with Brickworks in developing their CLT for a total of 30 units. And so in terms of looking at the different tools that the municipalities use in order to help build this CLT, or to develop this CLT rather, the municipality agreed to contribute $200,000 towards construction costs and $180,000 in in-kind contributions. And so these in-kind contributions included waiving planning application fees, building permit fees, and waiving development charges. And the municipality also offered a grant, which is the equivalent of property taxes over 10 years. And so a key difference also with this CLT is that it's being built from the ground up versus Parkdale's and other more urban CLTs that often, if I'm not mistaken, typically are focused on acquiring existing structures and providing affordable rental units. And so in conclusion, as we see here, as building affordable housing or managing affordable housing does fall within the municipality's jurisdiction, municipalities are encouraged to use various tools to support the development of CLTs, such as property exemptions, establishing inclusionary zoning policies, and providing loans and grants for affordable housing purposes and increasing the overall housing supply. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much. And I will stop sharing my screen and pass it along to James, who will be discussing co-ops with you.
Thanks, Princess. That was great. Well, hi, everybody. Quick intro to me, James Calderone. I am an affordable housing advocate and have worked in the co-op and non-housing or nonprofit housing space for about 10 years. My work in the sector has been largely focused on operational support, including asset management support and services. So dealing with things like major capital repair or refinancing projects, and assisting boards in the stewardship of their communities. I'm just going to open my PowerPoint here and share. Bear with me. Okay. Now I'm going to start the PowerPoint. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to co-op housing, and it's something that I hope people will think about and perhaps challenge with respect to some of the nuances of what I'll go through in the forthcoming discussion. What is co-op housing? I think there are a lot of immediate associations when people think of co-ops. People think of high rises, particularly in the urban context. They think of rental tenure, but fundamentally cooperative housing is a governance model first and foremost. You can have equity co-ops. You can, of course, have rental co-ops as well. But an interesting note on that particular front, equity co-ops, although not particularly popular today, were one of the more common means for individuals to control a multi-unit building prior to the popularization, excuse me, of condominiums. They're not as favored these days for a number of reasons, including financing challenges, but really want to underscore that cooperative housing is not intrinsically rental. It is also, again, not a specific built form, so it could be townhouses, it could be high-rise. There are no physical attributes that define it, so there's no shared kitchen per se. It is about how decisions are made within a given community. And associated with that, it's about democracy within a given building or community. So in the case of rental housing, it's not your standard landlord-tenant relationship. There are members that are most often residents, and they participate in, again, the decision-making of that organization, and as a result, their home. In Ontario, co-ops are legally incorporated as a cooperative corporation specifically. That's a provincial piece of legislation. So co-ops are slightly different across the country as a result of that. In Ontario, though, they're most often associated with, as I said, again, nonprofit rental housing and specifically social housing, which I'll elaborate on in a few slides. The cooperative housing sector has benefited greatly, both in Ontario, but more broadly in Canada as well, by wonderful representation by the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada and its local chapters. This is a very, I think, important point to note. Co-ops represent a rather small percentage of the overall housing numbers in Canada, but they punch above their weight class in no small part because of the great advocacy work done by groups such as the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. Another interesting to note about co-op housing, some people think of it as an inherently volunteer driven model. It's not the case. It's certainly encouraged, but these days most co-ops are managed in terms of maintenance and frontline administration by third-party service providers. So you're not necessarily having residents sit at a desk and collecting rents on behalf of the organization, for example. Most of these services are contracted out. Now, what can members do as part of democratic governance model? Well, they can elect other members to the board of directors to govern the business of the cooperative. And typically, I'll stress that, typically these members are fellow residents. There are exceptions, and it is possible for a non-resident member to exist and to be invited into the governance of the community. Members can also, though, vote on, importantly, bylaws that guide how the cooperative operates. And these bylaws are not distinct from the sort of bylaws that you would expect to see in a condominium corporation. So bylaws can include rules about things like turnover of units, or parking, which can often be a contentious issue in some communities. But in essence, the way that the business of the co-op is to be carried out. Members can also, through their the powers afforded to them, expect to receive audited financial statements on the cooperative's financial performance each and every year. Those, I'll stress the word audited statements, have to be vetted by a third party. That is a requirement. In short, a board of directors is empowered to run the organization on behalf of its members, but has a responsibility to make sure that someone's checking the numbers and then attesting to their accuracy before sharing that information with the membership. Now, in Ontario, it's perhaps most important to note that members of nonprofit housing co-ops also possess a right to vote on the housing charges, i.e. the rent paid to the organization. And this is one of the things that makes co-ops so distinct, and also can present some challenges. As you might expect, voting on rent will often lead to so not huge increases year over year. That's a wonderful thing. It avoids some of the escalation in rents that we have seen in the sector, or in the rental housing sector. But of course, there are costs that all organizations need to keep up with. And so for this reason, it's important to note that cooperative housing, while it has many, many virtues and wonderful attributes, is not necessarily the silver bullet for all housing ills. And going back to the previous point that I was making, one of the reasons for that is there can be the risk that if rents do not keep up with expenditures and the capital repair needs, most specifically of a community, the community can start to find itself in a bit of a hole. And so there has to be a good balance between communication about the needs, the expense requirements of the organization, and how revenue or their rents will be used to satisfy those requirements. If that messaging is not clearly understood, you can imagine that those gaps tend to grow, and a community can find itself in some trouble. Now, I should also note, as bulleted here on the screen, that co-op housing is not inherently affordable. Now, for the reasons just stated, I mean, most co-op housing leans towards lower than market rates. And given the sort of inherent self-interest, again, of most members in keeping their housing charges at a more moderate level. But what is affordable for one person is not necessarily affordable for another. And so what one person within a co-op community deems to be affordable may not be for their neighbor. And this, I think, warrants expanding on. Affordable housing is a term that's in the media all the time these days, and rightly so. But it's a relative term, and when it is defined, and it's defined in many different pieces of legislation, policy documents. City of Toronto has its own definition that is distinct, for example, from what CMHC articulates. While it is described in many different ways, these two are that you see on screen are probably the most commonly accepted measures of affordable housing. So 30% of a household's gross annual income being paid towards rent, or less than that amount, is deemed to be affordable by most standards. Or increasingly, there's been a move towards rent being deemed affordable if it is less than 80% of the average market rent within a given community. Now, these are dramatically different, these two metrics, in the depth of affordability and the target populations that they serve. You can imagine that 80% of average market rent in downtown Toronto is still not affordable to most people. And also, it's a static measure. It doesn't fluctuate in the same way that a 30% of gross household income calculation does. So if someone's income goes down under the first definition, obviously the amount payable would be lower. So this is the reason I bring up this point is most cooperative housing that exists in Ontario is actually social housing, and social housing specifically that was initiated under programs that provided support to achieve affordable housing as defined by the first of these bullets, 30% of gross household income. The programs generally are referred to as rent geared to income supports or programming. Now, social housing was touched on by Princess earlier, but just to go back to that, social housing is a kind of bigger umbrella under which co-op housing sits in the Ontario context most often. But it is defined by subsidized public or nonprofit rental housing, and typically has targeted historically low and moderate income groups. Now, that is not to say that everyone living in social housing fits in those categories. In fact, what distinguishes most social housing in Canada from other social housing programs around the world is that we have, certainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, taken more of a mixed income approach. So a percentage of people living within a social housing community would receive some sort of subsidy or rent geared to income support, as I mentioned, but others living in that building would pay a full housing charge or rent. And so that's a notable distinction and one worth highlighting. Now, we have a rather rich history of social housing and within that co-op housing production in Canada. But I should underscore again, history. We haven't done as much of this in the last 20 years or so, as Princess also touched on. Sort of heyday of social housing development was in the early 70s, well, let's say 70s and 80s. And you see a graph on your screen that shows the total housing commitments Canada-wide through a certain given period of time. You'll notice that the relative portion of public housing to nonprofit and co-op housing has shifted. So early on, it was a little more common to do more public housing, which was defined by a broader base of subsidized households within a social housing community. Regent Park in Toronto would be a wonderful example of that. When Regent Park was first initiated, there was, again, more broad support to the individuals living there. And we have shifted and done more nonprofit and co-op housing since. And I should also distinguish Regent Park from nonprofit and co-op housing in that it was also municipally initiated and owned and operated. So into the 90s and the early 2000s, again, these numbers have tapered off as a result of that retrenchment that the Princess mentioned. There has been an uptick in the more recent years as a result of mainly federal funding through programs such as the National Housing Strategy. We still, on a per capita basis, are well below what was initiated in the 70s and 80s, but there has been a marked change in the opportunity to develop new social housing and co-op housing specifically. Let me just see. Well, the next slide here includes or gives you a sense of how big co-op housing is across the country. You can see that Ontario, by quite a bit, has the most number of co-op housing units. Quebec, interestingly, has about half the number of units, but almost double the number of cooperative corporations, housing corporations specifically, indicating, of course, that the communities are just much smaller typically in Quebec than in Ontario. Again, there's no sort of magic number, though, to the number of units that can be governed by a particular cooperative corporation. There are, of course, though, economies of scale to be considered when initiating a new project. One other quick note on that point, going back to the previous slide, excuse me, is that all of these social housing commitments don't all necessarily represent new development, as in new buildings being constructed as purpose-built co-op or nonprofit housing. There was a pretty considerable wave of co-op and nonprofit homes that were conversions. So private rental buildings that largely in response to deteriorating conditions and a rally of support by residents ended up being converted to nonprofit and co-op housing. And those grassroots groups were able to secure funding, in most cases from the federal government, to purchase those buildings and to, again, convert their governance structure. So an interesting bit of history as to how we developed the numbers that you see here on screen. Quickly to talk about how co-op social housing is administered in Ontario. There are federally funded communities that have a direct relationship with the federal government through CMHC. And there are typically, and probably more commonly, municipal administered cooperative housing. And those projects would receive funding, rent-geared income subsidies, for example, from the likes of the City of Toronto, the City of Ottawa, the City of Windsor. But that money would not necessarily all come directly from the property tax base, which is the municipality's primary tool of generating revenue, of course. Much of the money issued to co-ops by municipalities is a flow-through, comes from, in some cases, the federal government to the provincial government and then to the municipality, or more of a leapfrog from one to the other. This is a quick slide that speaks to these distinct relationships. Again, the province has not played in Ontario a particularly active role in the direct administration or the development of co-op housing since the early 2000s. It's something that we might talk about in a few minutes with the panel as to how that might change and how that could perhaps help to create more affordable housing communities. But this is the environment that we currently find ourselves in. I'm going to just conclude at this point with a strong suggestion that if anybody is particularly interested in the nuance of the social housing sector and the history of it, that they pick up this wonderful book by Greg Suter, Still Renovating. It, I think, is probably about 4 or 5 years old now, at least, but probably, from my perspective, one of the most comprehensive and well-written, easy to read texts on the subject. So a little shout out to Greg and the wonderful work that he did in putting this together. I think I'm a little ahead of time, but with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Annika.
Thank you so much to James and to Princess for those very helpful overview presentations. I'll just apologize, there's a leaf blower or something in the background here, so I hope it's not too distracting. Thank you so much for that. We have a few minutes for any questions, if there are any at this moment of a sort of clarifying nature, and then we'll be happy to, we'll take a break and then we'll come back in with the panel shortly. There's a couple of comments up in the Q&A. Ian Jones has shared a link and notes that it's an answer to the housing crisis you might be interested in. So please feel free to take a look at that. Are there any questions, or if there are any questions, we'll just give it a moment for any to come there. And Princess and James, if you have anything that you want to jump in on there as well with each other's presentations, please feel free to. Chi and Sam, I see you there as well. If either of you has any comment that you want to add here, sort of by way of clarification, we'd be happy to have that too. And Marlene, I see there too. I'll make sure we don't sort of jump into the full panel discussion at this moment, but if there are any clarifications or anything you want to emphasize from the presentations, please feel free.
I do. I think the huge theme that stands out that is joined between Princess and James's presentation is that when people ask us about what's a CLT and what's a co-op, they're so curious about this work because they're so excited that there could be a solution to affordable housing. They expect an answer that is a building type or an architectural solution, and it isn't. It's not a form, it's a governance and a way of relating to each other and making decisions about our shared the commons and shared ownership. So I think that's like a really key thing to keep in mind, and we'll dig into it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Marlene or Sam, anything that you want to jump in with there? Good for now. Okay, then I'm going to suggest actually that we break now, if that's okay. And why don't we take actually till 12:30? Please do come back. I think there's going to be a really rich conversation that comes after this. And I know that the concern about taking a slightly longer break is that you won't return. I think you will, because I know you're eager like I am to hear from all of these folks. But let's give you 10 minutes to stretch your legs, and then we'll come back in with our panel discussion at 12:30. Thank you so much to Princess and to James for starting us off, and we'll see you all very shortly. Okay, welcome back, everyone. If I could ask our panelists to come back on screen when you're ready as well, please, and we'll get started. I'm sad to say the leaf blowing has not ceased. I'm not sure what our addiction to leaf blowing is in this community, but it continues.
We cannot hear. I can't hear it on my end, at least.
Okay, glad to hear. Glad to hear. Okay, we'll just give it a second for everyone to pop back in. We're just waiting on Judy. We'll give it 1 second.
I'm here. I'm unable to go back on video because I was canceled by the moderator. I was taken off video by the moderator, so when I try to go back on, it says I can't.
Oh, let me double check, and we'll get you back on here right away. Can you try again, Judy, and see if it'll let you on now? Perfect. Wonderful. There we go. And I'll just introduce Judy. I think you joined us just after I ran through the first round of very brief introductions this morning. So I'll just introduce Judy, who's here with us from the Opportunity Villages Community Land Trust in Chatham, Ontario. We are so thrilled to have Southwest Ontario represented in this conversation. It often, one of the challenges that we face and one of the places or spaces that we seek to fill as a center is to make sure that the voices and the experiences of mid-sized cities and smaller communities are represented in some of these conversations, and that we're able to kind of draw some of the connecting lines between what sometimes feels like more innovative things happening in the bigger cities. But I see Chi shaking your head, and that's great to see. But to make sure that those stories get told as well, and that the kind of the exchange of expertise and experiences is happening across smaller municipalities as well. So thrilled to be able to include Chatham in this conversation. Good. I think we have everyone back. So thank you again. And thanks to all of our attendees for returning. And I'll just say too, I know you all can't see who else is there. That's one of the challenges of the webinar format. But I can tell you that we have representatives from a lot of different municipalities, especially across Southwest Ontario. We have folks from across the country joining us from other municipalities as well. Folks from national organizations on work related to housing and municipal policy. We have, I see people from the province. And I see groups, nonprofit and students. So, really a broad cross section of people with interest in this topic from a variety of different backgrounds. So just to sort of, I think, keep that in mind as we move forward in terms of the audience that we're hitting. So Princess and I are going to co-moderate this together. I'm very happy to be able to rely on Princess here, who has a deep experience already in her relatively early career already with housing. With housing policy, and so I'm really pleased that she's a part of this conversation as well. Just to get things started off, I know there's some of you we haven't heard from yet, and so we'll do it through the tab, and we'll start with those that we haven't heard from yet on the panel. And if you can just tell us a little bit, just remind us of your names. Again, everyone's bios are in the chat. And your position with your organization, and then just a little bit about the project that you're most closely aligned with in this space at the moment. I know that relates a little more to some of you than others. Marlene, you're here to give us a little broader perspective, so feel free to tell us a little bit about your organization when we get to you. But we'll just sort of do that to get everybody on the table there. Chi, maybe we can start with you.
Lovely. Thank you all for the great presentations. Stoked that so many people are here curious about the topic. My name is Chi Tam. My pronouns are she and her. I operate in a very hyper-focused neighborhood basis in Kensington Market and Chinatown, which are side by side in a downtown context in Toronto. I'm raised from Musqueam territory over in Vancouver. So it's very different operating on this land that isn't as explicitly unceded. So those two projects I'll say are CLTs that both have a cultural focus, that have a focus beyond housing because they are mixed use areas. They have Afro-Caribbean community, they have Jewish community, they have a lot of faith-based institutions that have built the layers of the neighborhood over time. So that's a really dynamic and interesting element of our work in trying to seize properties for community benefit, is that obviously the housing crisis is our largest crisis. And so we do provide housing as our central focus, but it has never been the only focus, following our big sister with Sam and folks over in Parkdale. So I'm also a cooperative developer. I'm extremely nerdy and enthusiastic about governance and talking about bylaws and thinking through legislation. So this is my crew of people. I'm so thrilled to be with you guys.
I feel like it's only logical that I might hop in now.
Please do that.
So hello, everybody. And I echo all the enthusiasm and excitement just to be here with everybody today. My name is Sam Carter-Shamai, born and raised in downtown Toronto, and have been with the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust and Neighbourhood Land Trust for coming on 3 years now. I sometimes sort of scratch my head and think that I ended up so fully immersed in the housing area almost by accident, but it's not totally an accident. I will say though that I came to this field through my work as a planner, trying to support cultural activities, and what I kept on sort of running into over and over again is if there's a single thing that we can do to support cultural activities, musical landscapes, artists and workers' production, it is provide stable and affordable housing. And so that's what sort of really sort of grounds it for me. And it's a short story as to how I came to be here. I guess I will say that it's been super exciting to be part of the Neighbourhood Land Trust, the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust over these past few years, which have seen a really dramatic growth in our own portfolio. And as she was mentioning, I think it's equally as inspiring and encouraging to see how the path is being taken up by so many other organizations, again, throughout Toronto, but more broadly as well. And again, it's just so great to see how many people there are in this video, in this workshop today. So I'll leave it at that for now, but can't wait to get into some of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Sam. Maybe we can go to Judy next.
Okay. I'm from Opportunity Villages Community Land Trust. I'm secretary of the board. We haven't built yet. We're running into challenges that I'll talk about a little bit. What we want to do is provide affordable home ownership. So it's a little bit different. We're a land trust, but rather than rentals, we want people to be able to buy homes at an affordable price. We have property to build 30 units. They're single house, bi-level, or by and tri units. We also have because there's small footprint under 1,000 square feet. So because of that, we're also building a community building, a common unit for people to use. And it'll be the power hub for it. We want it to also be net zero. Some of the problems that we've run into is because we're doing ownership, we don't have the government funding that they do for rentals. That hasn't been built in yet. So the funding's been a challenge. I grew up in Windsor, and I started a GoFundMe for this thinking, oh, we should be able to raise all kinds of money. Chatham-Kent is a lot smaller than Windsor, so it isn't as easy to do fundraising here. We've also run into problems with environmental approvals. The brickworks was originally a property of a brickworks. So it was zoned for apartments, which doesn't need the same environmental approvals as single family units, and where people are going to be like sitting down in the yard and things like that. So right now we have to get, we're at phase 2 of environmental approvals, and we found that there's one area that's basically got too much rock salt that was dumped on it. So we're gonna have to get that remediated. And it's taking a long time when all the work is done for the Ministry of Environment to do their part of getting it through, partly because of COVID, partly because of it just takes time. So I don't know if I've answered all the questions you'd like me to answer in my introduction or not.
That's great. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to some pieces of that. That's wonderful. Thanks. Marlene, I'm going to hold you off just for 1 second because I just want to ask James, I want to sort of come to community housing last. James, is there anything about sort of specific projects that you've worked on in the co-op sphere that you would want to give it just as an example to sort of give some color to the conversation? I know you're working in a slightly different sphere now, but
sorry, in what respect? Like, I'm not quite following you
sure.
there.
Just if there was any particular projects that you were hyper focused on and you sort of use G's language during your time working in the co-op housing space.
Sure. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the work that I did previously in the sector was that it was support for a whole host of communities across the province, and very often with large capital projects at each. So, you do a very significant deep dive on a particular scope with the support of building consultants, engineers, to wrap your head around a building problem, and then come up with a remedy and the price tag to fix it, and then make sure that the funding was there, if not all funded through capital reserves that exist within the community, going out with an open hand to funding authorities and seeing if you can get some assistance. So that really dominated the work that I did in the last few years. Some new housing development was in the early stages of being contemplated, but one of the things we can talk about, and maybe to touch on Judith's point, is the process of development is not straightforward, not even just from a land use planning perspective, but even just from a collaboration and governance perspective, to get people around a table and to agree on a plan and the financial implications is no small order. And so these projects typically have long runways, and I'm sure most people on the panel here can attest to that.
Perfect. Thanks so much, James. And Marlene, I'm going to turn the floor to you next. So you're coming at this from a slightly different perspective and a little more global view, I would think. Can you tell us a bit about your work and your organization's work and how this connects to the work being done by the others on the panel in the CLT and co-op space?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here, and it's really great to be with all of you. I'm actually going to go back to a slide that we had seen during the presentation around the housing continuum, because I think it's an important part of framing the larger spectrum that we're talking about here. So we know on the one hand of the continuum, we have homelessness. On the other hand, we have home ownership, and there's this large swath in the middle called community housing and rental housing. And so I'm with the Nonprofit Housing Association, representing the sector of nonprofit housing providers. And what that means is we actually are responsible for a large part of that middle section of rental housing along the housing continuum. And what we love to see, and what I'm enjoying about our panelists today, is that there are many options so that people have choice as life changes and needs change for individuals and families, that they have choice within that continuum to live a really healthy and productive life. And of course, we know that housing affordability and security is a key determinant of health. So I represent a sector of 700 housing providers. The other term you might use is landlords, and those landlords have very complex housing portfolios. So I'm not referring to singular buildings, but I'm really referring to corporations that run portfolios of housing. And so that means we represent 170,000 units in the province of Ontario. That's a $40 billion asset, not including the value of land. And we're housing 500,000 people in Ontario in 220 communities. So we have very big urban housing providers. We have the smaller, more remote housing providers, and of course, your mid-sized providers in those outlying areas. What we advocate for is that we are part of the Build More Supply solutions. So we're advocating for building more. We also advocate for maintaining the stock as social infrastructure that we already have in the province of Ontario. So it's not only important to build more, but it's also important to keep what we have and keep it in really good shape so that we can continue to deliver a great product to tenants. And then the third pillar of what we advocate for is really securing rental with affordability and deep affordability as a viable long-term option for Ontarians. And so the goal that we have is to build 99,000 units over the next 10 years, which lines up with the National Housing Strategy. And of course, many of you will know that we're well into the National Housing Strategy with the goal of ending homelessness. So 99,000 units is our goal over 10 years. And we have identified that within the 99,000 units, we also need to build 22,000 units that are specific to Indigenous communities, where those homes are owned, operated, and governed by Indigenous communities. So that's who we are and the perspective I come from, and really happy to be here as part of the panel.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, and I was going to turn the questions over to Princess. Go ahead, Princess.
No, not at all. Like, there has been so many different key themes that have been brought up by everyone that I definitely want to unpack. One theme is the idea of course, you know, housing is driving a lot of the models and solutions that we're choosing, but there are other coexisting issues that lead to, you know, communities choosing CLTs or co-ops as a model and being provide a range of choices, as Marlene mentioned. And so my question, and I'll maybe start with Chi, is why wasn't a CLT chosen as a specific model for the specific project you're working on in your communities?
Why was it chosen as a solution? So I'll say that I'll use Kensington Market specifically as opposed to the Chinatown CLT or Little Jamaica or anywhere else. I'm the executive director of Kensington Market Community Land Trust. We are a small group. We've existed since 2017, but the conversation about wanting to create something like this started 7 years prior. So it started in 2010, and it came from a very different origin than most CLTs in Canada. That comes from an anti-displacement, anti-gentrification core. There was a group called Friends of Kensington Market that is one amongst, I would say, hundreds of groups that are hyper concentrated in this incredible neighborhood called Kensington Market. Kensington Market has a history of being segregated from the rest of Toronto intentionally by immigration policies, by property laws that were incredibly racist towards, that also anti-Semitic towards the Jewish community in lending terms, and then later on towards the Chinese community in the 1960s. So in that background, we now have a community that has been made interesting because poor people live in it and have innovated to make a life for themselves, right? They've knocked out their living rooms and created this incredible dynamic streetscape. And so in a neighborhood like that, you come into the 2000s and you come now into the 2020s. And now we are the #1 tourist destination of Toronto because nowhere else in the city feels like Kensington Market. And it is driving us insane. We are not a destination, we are a place where real people live. And if the moment you create a destination out of a neighborhood, the soul of the neighborhood dies. And what we would dream is for all of Toronto and all of Ontario to have distinct and different tourist destinations and attractions that isn't putting all of this pressure just on our neighborhood, because poor people still live in our neighborhood and should continue to in the future. It has been a landing pad for new immigrants to start businesses, etc. So in and amongst the hundreds of neighborhood action groups and committees and and the protests and the whining and the crying and the heartbreak that has happened in this neighborhood over things that have happened, it was like, oh my God, we need to stop fighting. We need to stop reacting to the crises that keep on coming to our neighborhood, to the people that are being pushed out, whether they are renters or homeowners that are being bullied out of extremely complicated mortgage situations and loans that they didn't understand, or if it was tenants who were being evicted through renovictions and through the Airbnb proliferation through Toronto. So in that context, we was like, I think it's time for something like Friends of Kensington Market to happen. And in the conversation with Friends of Kensington Market, they were like, we need to build something of our own that actually gives us back energy, that gives us a long-term solution that we have control over the timeline, instead of just fighting Walmart because it's coming in, or fighting a new like huge private condominium that's completely for profit and has no affordable units. So that is why we decided to choose a CLT. We had heard that it was mostly home ownership based in the United States. Of the thousands that exist there, we got connected with their consultants. We flew our organizers. We fundraised and did bake sales around the neighborhood to fly local neighbors to conventions and organizing conferences around the world to learn from the UK, to look at different models that existed. And talk to the cooperative housing sector about how that all intersects. But housing was not the core thing, because there are stores that are underneath the houses. And so there's a lot about policy in Canada that complicates our understanding of whether or not we can live and work and play in the literal same space, as opposed to just live in one space and work in the adjacent space, right? So that's kind of the spirit of Kensington Market Community Land Trust, and why we decided the CLT itself was the best path forward. I think it captured a neighborhood-wide energy while still being quite specific in the geographic focus. It allowed us to create a membership base and a democratic process to make decisions about what our priorities should be in our neighborhood. That wasn't hosted by the planning department. That wasn't hosted by the City of Toronto or the province of Ontario. That was on our own terms. We could put up a map, or put up a whiteboard, or put up a presentation for ourselves and make decisions about how do we want our block to look like, and not on anybody else's study timeline or master planning timeline or development timeline. What do we want our neighborhood to look like, and create our own what we call people's planning process. And through that, a community land trust best captures that membership structure, because we were like, who do we want to be able to vote? And who do we want to be in conversation with? And so we had a long and hard conversation about who should be able to vote. And so right now we have 3 categories of members. Learning from Parkdale, we know that Parkdale has organizational members, and that's one big difference between us. We decided to not go for that. We didn't want there to be appointed voting members from organizations locally. As much as we love our legal clinic, we love our tenants union, we love all the other organizations, we wanted people to be coming to the table as individuals. And so there's a geographic boundary. If you live or work within this boundary of Kensington Market, you get a vote. But we never take decisions to a vote. We do things by consensus unless we're legally required to host a vote. And we test for consensus at the end of each of our motions and decisions and meetings. So yeah,
jump in there, Chi, if you don't mind, just so we can make sure that we hear from everyone, and maybe we can come back to you on some more of the details as we go, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
I do want to, that was great. And I think it really exemplifies the way that you're centering, the people who have not been involved in the process, and how CLTs really center that. And when we think about like the mixed use of the community, it's not just about housing, it is about the commercial businesses and other types of uses for that land. And one thing that I thought of is, there is a bit of a difference between big urban centers such as Kensington Market in Toronto, and how it is a tourist destination, versus the cities that are not always tourist destinations for people such as Chatham. And so how people come together, different stakeholders come together to build their CLTs may be a little different too. So I do want to pass it to Judith, who if you can explain why a CLT was specifically chosen for your community and how you might see it be a little bit different compared to bigger urban settings.
The CLT was chosen to help bring down the price. We will retain ownership of the land. So we want to have affordable housing. There, like everywhere else, there's a shortage. What else did it? What was the other half of the question, please?
Yes, just the idea of why it was chosen, how it might be different from a bigger city, developing a CLT in a bigger city.
Well, from what I'm hearing from Toronto, there's a lot of participation from the municipality. We don't have that tax base to be able to get that kind of participation from the municipality. So that's one of the things. So with our the fundraising that we're doing, we're they have helped, but they're not able to help the way they are in a place like Toronto.
No, absolutely. I think the resources tends to be a bigger piece. But I believe it was a interview that you were part of in terms of a long-term article that spoke to how CLTs can really bring in different stakeholders. It might be even a little easier for smaller communities where, you know, there aren't as many spaces to kind of be in your own silos in that way. And so in terms of a CLTs continuing to fill that gap, or co-ops filling that gap, I do want to turn to Marlene quickly in terms of how do you see CLTs and co-ops filling the gap in the broader range of affordable housing, or the housing continuum more broadly?
Thanks for the question. It really goes back to having choice a lot for people in communities, and to have that distinctiveness within each community. So it's not prescribed. It's really about a mission based housing that has what we all share here is a shared objective of building out long-term affordable and sustainable housing with deep affordability built in there for those who need it. So it really is about choice and community and being individualized across the province. I think what you were tipping to, Princess, is sort of where the distinction is between a not-for-profit and some of the other models that we're hearing about today. And so again, mandates shared, it's a similar idea. It really comes down to the governance model and how those corporations are run. So as a not-for-profit, in our sector, there's sort of three big models within our membership, our association, and that would be the local housing corporations. So this is where there's a large stake or ownership by the local municipality in a local housing corporation, still run as a not-for-profit organization to make sure that affordability and deep affordability is built into the mandate and the model. But the ownership is coming from the municipality, and that's called a local housing corporation. We also have the true independent not-for-profits, and of course our sector has many, many of those. Mission driven, always around a board of directors who are making sure that that organization is remaining viable and delivering on its mandate, which also includes affordable and deep affordability. And of course, what that means is that depending on the household or the tenant that is in that housing, is that there's rent geared to income. And so this is where there's a relationship then with the government, in that often either the municipality or the province or the federal government, depending on which program you're tapping into, sometimes many programs, the gap between market rents and where the subsidy lies for that household is covered through a variety of different funding programs. And that's what makes it work, because the provider can have some market rents built in there and have some subsidized units as well to make sure that the whole building works as a footprint. And then the third that is also part of our sector is supportive housing providers. So what we hear from Ontarians is they want more affordability, they need more affordability, they believe that all of us benefit from affordable housing in our communities. We did do some polling just before the election to hear from the population. And what we heard loud and clear is that housing affordability is as important to, if not more important than, healthcare, transportation, environment. So an absolutely key issue in the election that we just had here in the province of Ontario, and a central issue for Ontarians, and it's not going away. We know that deep affordability will continue to be needed in order to build those whole and complete communities, which I know is the mandate of the centre here.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Deep unaffordability, of course, is the driving crisis across different types of issues too, which often impact, of course, marginalized communities. And so I do want to turn it to Sam too to speak about why CLTs was chosen for Parkdale, as well as speak to, once again, the different community and social issues that align with the community land trust model.
Without getting all the way into the deep history, I'll start by saying that a lot of the neighborhood conditions and sort of context in Parkdale, obviously not the same, but there are parallels with how this neighborhood and this community has existed with what she was describing in Kensington Market. I mean, primarily that this neighborhood has, for the recent past, been primarily a place where lower income, where poor people live, and it is because of that it has this distinctive charm. It's a huge. I believe it's the largest concentration of Tibetan immigrants outside of Tibet. It's been historically a landing place for all sorts of immigrant communities to come into the city, and that's what it makes Parkdale so great. Where I'd like to sort of pick up the thread to sort of answer the question is, in the earlier days, and I may have alluded to this earlier, in the earlier days of the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust being, the focus was on sort of research and advocacy. We didn't have a tremendous amount of properties. I believe in the early days, there was one property, it was a community garden that had been donated to the organization from some residents who I believe their initial intention was to make a laneway house, but they weren't able to do it, and so they said, we can give back to the community, make a land trust. With the beginning, with that seeding site, we had the platform to start doing this advocacy and research. And one of the pieces that we latched onto was the notion that the reality that a lot of houses that had been previously subdivided into all kinds of rooming houses and granny suites and provided those deeply affordable units for low-income people in the neighborhood were being bought up by affluent individuals and flipped into single-family houses, mansions, and we saw this as a direct threat and started to quantify and assess what that looked like. And it was on the back of that initial rooming house study that we were able to bring to the City of Toronto to bring a microscope, bring a magnifying glass to this issue that was playing out all across our neighborhood, certainly, but it also expresses itself elsewhere in the city, and say, what can we do to stop this? And it was on the back of that study that the first partnership sort of occurred to establish our first residential property acquisition, which was a rooming house. And I think as we sort of continued to build momentum, eventually we were able to acquire an adjacent property, which was a small sort of 3-story walk-up apartment, and that was a big deal. It increased the number of units that we had, by more than double. But then most recently, as you, Princess, were mentioning in your presentation, and she mentioned in some of the chat responses, we've recently acquired a whole host of new properties, 81 properties that are scattered all across the downtown west side of the city. And if I can sort of segue just a little bit to the governance structure and the challenges that this growth has presented for the organization, I think it's really interesting because with this new acquisition, our portfolio of properties is no longer centered just in Parkdale. And this presents some challenges as to how do we retain the place-based, organization-based community interest that has been the heart and soul of the land trust for so long, while also expanding our reach and our impact. So it's presented a whole bunch of really interesting challenges. And again, I'm trying not to get all the way into the weeds with it, but I will say that the way that the Neighbourhood Land Trust, the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust was set up is effectively there are actually two separate organizations. Is why I keep on making the distinction between the Neighbourhood Land Trust and the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust. The Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust is a community-based nonprofit whose membership is defined by geography, by membership, by living or working in owned properties by the NLT and the organizational members that she mentioned as well. Then there's the NLT, which is a charitable organization, also a nonprofit, But the NLT is the organization that actually owns the properties. We take our direction, the membership of the NLT is effectively the board of directors of the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust. And so we take, on the NLT, which is where I sit, we take direction from the community and figure out how do we action and execute on that vision, on those priorities. As the portfolio grows, in the fullness of time, the expectation is that these other communities may be able to develop capacity to effectively create their own boards, similar to, own neighborhood place-based boards, similar to the Parkdale organization. But in the meantime, we sort of have to straddle both priorities, the local in Parkdale, as well as the emerging needs and community priorities as defined by residents of these other portfolios. And in doing so, not only providing the needs, providing for the needs of being a good landlord, but also building that capacity so that these community members can step into their own to sort of take the reins of their community organizations and create sort of effectively sister land trusts that will, in the same way as right now the NLT's membership is made up of the board of the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust. In the future, we hope that we'll be able to get to a point where we're being informed by the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust and the Annex Neighbourhood Land Trust and whoever else are the responsive communities who have found their voice and are able to organize and advocate for their own priorities, because it's not a single brush type of approach. Never is.
Thanks so much, Sam. And just I want to turn to James in a second, but just to sort of pull out from that, I guess. I mean, I think one of the differences that we're seeing in the Chatham example is, as you mentioned, that sort of it doesn't seem to have the same kind of a movement feel. If maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, Judy, but it feels like maybe those sort of earlier kind of organizing or advocacy pieces were less a part of the organizing structure, maybe, or the reason for organizing in the first place with Chatham. Is that a safe statement, or do you feel that likewise it sort of came out of a push point where there needed to be a kind of a movement, or there was a movement developing there?
The way it originated was that somebody was interested in tiny homes, and they recognized that there was a lack of housing in the area. And from the tiny homes, it evolved into the smaller footprint homes, mainly because there's a need for it. And we preferred the home ownership model to the rental model to help people get out of that cycle. So there is security, but then they are also building some equity. The homes will sell for below market, so they're affordable, but we intend that to continue in perpetuity. So the price of housing goes up greatly. They'll still make money on the equity between the difference, but it'll still be the next person that purchases it will be able to buy it for less. And I think your original question was like, what motivated us to go that route, was basically that it's something that's different, but we saw that it would benefit people to actually own homes.
Really interesting. Okay, and I want to come back to some of those pieces in a bit. Maybe a question for you, Judy, or for any of you really who are deeply ensconced in the CLT world at the moment. I mean, where do you see? I think there's only something like 20 CLTs at the moment across the country. Is that right? I think one of you told me that the other day. No, okay, totally wrong figure. I mean, if you have a figure, that's great. I'll leave the floor to you to let us know. And in terms of seeing where the movement is on CLTs nationally right now, do you see that most of what's developing are still kind of, again, that like coming out of histories like Kensington or Parkdale, or are you starting to see more take up from situations a little more like Chatham, where it's like, we're going to try something different, we want to innovate, but maybe not that same kind of history or the kind of push factor in the same way?
I would say the push factor is consistent. So this is me speaking as a steering member of the Canadian network of community land trusts nationally. In my inbox, I am seeing like every day a new group is like, hey, we started a CLT. how do we become a member? Like, help us. And it's maybe sometimes it's literally just 3 neighbors, like 3 aunties just got on a patio and was like, we're starting a CLT. And honestly, that's all you need. But the reasons are so disparate. Tiny homes is a great example. People wanting a better solution than agricultural trusts so that they don't have to only farm on certain lands. They can also provide housing to farmers. That's a big area of interest, especially in rural and regional economy, community economic development contexts. We have a lot of municipalities and provincial economic development offices reaching out to us directly, curious about the model, curious about, again, its difference from the co-op sector, and wanting to bring us in as consultants to be like, could we gift a property to a non-existent CLT yet and just start it from a top-down lens? And just as like a question mark of like, do all CLTs inherently have to come from bottom up? And I think a thing that was really impressive about Princess doing a presentation to summarize CLTs is that in the Canadian context, I don't think there is a consensus point of what the definition of a CLT in the Canadian practice is. I think we are about to emerge to that point. We have had a lot of like not conflict, but really healthy like argument about what it should be. I have a personal opinion that is different than, you know, Josh over in Parkdale, and we literally debate this all the time over beers about whether it must be democratically managed or not. So different. If your interest basis is in that you have a property that you want to donate and you want to make sure it is used for community benefit in general, that's also an impetus for people wanting to set up CLTs. So sometimes the group and the community consensus isn't there, the activism isn't there, but the problem is, and the seeking for a container for whatever that holding mechanism would be, so long as it holds it in perpetuity, that's the one thing that is crystal clear and common. But it's been fascinating, so fascinating to see, and really moving projects that are Indigenous led, that are like, this is about land back, this is about us regaining sovereignty and stewardship literally over property and converting it into Indigenous ownership. And then a lot of cultural reclamation projects as well. But by far and large, like the most properties we have are sometimes just, they're not really like CLTs, they're just CLTs in the sense that they're an administrative body for co-ops, so that they don't have to deal with the headache of capital repairs and property management and all the stuff that James was talking about. So different door to door.
Amazing. That's such helpful context. Thank you. It actually clarifies a lot for me, and I think for a lot of us who are listening probably, and great to sort of hear that pathway forward is coming as well, and the momentum behind it. That's actually a great segue. I wanted to go to James next to talk about co-ops a bit more, and I want to say too, you know, we kind of pulled out CLTs and co-ops as examples of non-market, non-community housing, like state-led solutions. But I think the point is just to be able to highlight in a broader sense that there is innovation happening in this space, that you know, to sort of be able to define at least a couple of examples that seem to be sort of leading the way, and just to understand how much room for growth there is here too in a systems approach to dealing with housing affordability. James, I mean, the folks that you've worked with and the organizations that you've worked with, I mean, why do you see people choosing co-op as their format, or their sort of organizing feature? And I guess maybe while you're answering that, if you want, I think one of the other pieces that we've heard come up, and I think you mentioned that earlier, and I think it just came up in your comments a little bit too, is this sort of overlap between co-op and CLT. So if that's a piece you want to touch, you're also welcome to go there as well. But if you could start with why a co-op?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, the most attractive element is that notion of democratic control or participatory governance. You know, your standard rental setup, landlord-tenant, is very one-sided from a control or power dynamic, and co-ops flip that, you know, on its head, right? There is no, you know, well, I'm not going to say, you know, across the board, but very seldom is there the standard landlord in the co-op model. You know, you could think, and the reason I hesitated there is, you know, the land trust co-op hybrid, you know, does involve potentially a bit of a kind of landlord relationship between two organizations, but it's nothing like what we normally associate a landlord-tenant relationship as. So that's I think the appeal. It's also interesting to note though that there have been new co-ops created, no doubt. over the last, say, 20 years, but the number has not been significant. Where co-op development is probably most active is in infill development. So co-op communities that have surplus of land on their existing site or are able to acquire in close proximity another property, they've been able to access resources to allow them to build and expand. So it's an expansion of their existing membership or base. There again, are examples of where new co-ops have popped up, but not nearly in the same number, which is interesting. Yeah. Chi, I'd love to hear your take on the co-op CLT overlap.
I think it's a happy marriage when it works, and there are hundreds and hundreds of units in British Columbia. That's the predominant model. But the land trust is almost owned by the co-ops, like the membership of the land trust is the cooperative members. And so that democratic control completely overlaps in that sense. I think what I often point to when people ask me about the difference between CLTs and co-ops is there are some key decisions that we can argue about and debate in our membership that will have very different outcomes if you take it to a co-op board versus a CLT board. Because the CLT board has people who don't live in that building and are just part of the neighborhood writ large, their interests are broader. They're also, it might sometimes better reflect an interest that is people wanting to be future residents of that housing. And so much as you do have invited members into a lot of co-ops for their technical expertise, most typically, and for all of the functions, most of the time, if you ask a group, hey, will you remortgage your building and take that level of financial risk in order to acquire more properties? That's a very difficult decision to ask a group of people who are already in like a relatively old house to make together. As much as they're like very cooperative in spirit and they love the movement, that's hard. That's asking someone to remortgage their house. And as a group, as a committee too, not even literally just their own. They're like, I could make that decision for myself, but I wouldn't risk like Tim and Jane and everyone else who lives down the hall from me. That's a decision that a CLT would make in a heartbeat. We would not even hesitate. We would right away remortgage our property and go and aggressively acquire more groups because we have a waiting list of people in our membership and in the neighborhood that we know are getting evicted and they need housing now, right? So it's like, I hate it when people are like, oh, so you're saying that co-ops are more conservative. It's not as simple as that. But like, if you're meaning conservative in like the expansive sense of the word, it's just that they're being faced with a different level of risk assessment. And so that's I think actually one of the most core and key examples in the nonprofit and community housing sector generally. It's a debate we're having sector-wide, not just CLTs and co-ops, but Marlene's membership probably is talking a lot about like refinancing, et cetera. And so, yeah, that one's really present in my mind.
Excellent point, for sure.
Marlene, did you want to jump in on any of that in your vantage point?
Yeah, I can say that the not-for-profit sector, that this includes co-ops in this number, we have built historically 90% of affordable housing in Ontario. And so that really goes to that mission-driven model where we're in a long-term business to make sure that affordability is baked into every day in terms of what's delivered to the tenants. And it's an interesting question in terms of how do we finance the next level? So how do we finance maintaining the stock that's already been built, in many cases 30, 40, 50 years ago. So as anybody knows, buildings age, they need a little bit of attention if we want to make sure that investment continues to get that ROI. And of course, we're very, very interested in building more because we know that part of the solution, it's not the only solution, but part of the solution is adding more supply. And so we make great partnerships with the private sector, for example, to work with the private sector to potentially lead and build the asset and then have a transfer of ownership or some sort of agreement where the not-for-profit continues to operate and deliver that service to people. We know that there's a complexity of tenancy, which means that we are not simply landlords, not-for-profits and co-ops inclusive do a lot of other things to make sure that people are successful in their tenancy. And so of course that also costs money and requires expertise. And we're very, very good at that. We also work very closely with all levels of government. So it really is a partnership in terms of building social infrastructure. So municipalities have a large stake in community housing and are often funding 30%, if not more, of ensuring that the community housing in their particular region, city region, is successful, as is the province coming to the table with the federal government. And so the complexity of what we're getting into, so renewing mortgages came up. Our sector is going through a phase right now where what was negotiated 30 plus years ago in terms of a mortgage, those mortgages are expiring, which means there's now a new turnover of cash that can be invested into community housing. And we're doing a lot of work on the advocacy front to get our message out, which is that community housing is a great return on investment. We know that for every $10 put into a not-for-profit, there is a $20 savings downstream to the taxpayer to invest and ensure that housing affordability is maintained. So when you take a systems approach, which I've heard you speak to many times, this is the answer. The group on your panel here today is in fact the solution. We have many, many different models of how we can protect Ontario from the risk. So we know that 1/3 of Ontarians are renters, and of those renters, 1/3 are in core need and higher risk of displacement. And so Ontario's behind. We need to build more. We need to maintain what we have, and we need to support. And the group that you have here on your panel is in fact the solution.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Marlene, and yeah, wonderful and inspiring words to hear as we near the end of the panel. I'm going to ask for a couple of things. I'm going to ask one lightning round question that I think comes very nicely off of your question. So thank you, Marlene. And then I'm going to turn it back to Princess for one more quick question. And I think that's going to take us near the end. I know that a few Q&As have been, or a few questions have come up, and I think people have been responding to some of them offline as well, but I think most of them are themes that we're getting to as well. Here is my lightning round question for you all, and I'm going to go to Sam first. What is the one thing, the one most important thing that municipalities or other levels of government need to be doing to better support the innovative work you're doing?
To answer this quickly, the one simplest thing is to recognize that the way that the programs that exist can generally anticipate a single entity on the other side of the deal. If there's like a CMHC loan program, they're anticipating that there's a single organization, individual, et cetera, on the other side of the deal. One thing that was a big and unexpected challenge as we were making this acquisition and engaging with all of these government programs was that our operational model involved a partnership with the YWCA as leaseholders and property managers, as basically operators of the housing. And this suddenly established a more complex table for negotiating. And I have to shout out all of not only the hard work of staff at the NLT and the PNLT, but also our legal representatives, because this was a wild and unexpectedly uncharted territory. And so if there's a single thing that governments can do, it is acknowledging that the way that business has been done before, the way that these programs are crafted, can't be rigid. And we need to be able to understand that there may be different configurations of partnerships that are necessary to be able to execute and actualize on implement these plans and projects.
Perfect, thank you. Judy, why don't we go to you next?
I would agree with him that they need to be more flexible in recognizing the different types of partnerships to work with. In our case, we're not, because we're doing something different to what everybody else has done. That's in itself has caused roadblocks.
Perfect. Thank you. James.
I'll risk being a little provocative here and say that I think municipalities need to be a little more bold in their definition of affordable housing. We've seen that evolve over the last 15 years or so to things like, again, 80% of average market rent. And I don't think that's in keeping with the history and the definitions that have dominated the sector traditionally, and I think it's frankly better to think of it as a moving and lower percentage like that.
Perfect. Thank you. Who am I missing? Chi, I'll go to you, and then to Marlene. I feel like I'm always bringing you in at the end, Marlene, to wrap us up, but we really appreciate the context that you bring to this as well. Chi,
Marlene's the most experienced advocate, so it's good to wrap up with Marlene on a bang. It's hard to choose just one, but if we chose just one, would be for different levels of government to remember that non-market solutions, nonprofit housing sector broadly, not just CLTs, are developers. Like, I think there's this idea that the only people who develop housing are in the private sphere, and that's just categorically untrue. Dollar for dollar, to Marlene's point, if you spend all of the subsidies you give to private for-profit developers instead to the non-market housing operators to develop the same units of building, you would get permanent housing instead of 20-year temporary, like to 80% AMR instead of rent geared to income permanent 100% affordable housing, which I am capable of developing a pro forma for and capable to build. We just need to understand that. To Marlene.
Lots of nodding heads here, and yeah, to round it up for you, I think the answer is keep housing money in housing. So what that means is, from a municipal perspective, when mortgages are coming new and the municipality has that funding line, that those funds are reinvested into community housing to either repair assets or to build more supply for this demand that we know is very serious and much needed. Provincially, I would say keep the housing money in housing by utilizing some of those revenue lines through taxed housing transfer, land transfer, or vacant home taxes, or anything related to housing. Reinvest those funds back into housing, because we know there really is a substantial return on investment that helps Ontario save the taxpayer money in terms of long-term costs for healthcare, homelessness and shelters, and the justice system, and all support all sorts of additional costs that governments often incur. So it's a great return on investment. We're very creative, we make great partners, and we're in a long-term game to make sure that housing affordability is built into every community.
Thank you so much, Marlene. And I'm going to turn the floor back to Princess just to round up, and in particular to summarize a couple of the questions that we didn't get to, but that kind of bring us back to our home in a law faculty as well. So just to sort of remind ourselves of all the different pieces that come into these puzzles. Princess.
Yes, I wish we could get into everything. There's been so many key points that we haven't been able to discuss just for time, but I guess that shows just how much more is needed for sessions like these, and how much more knowledge, capacity, and community capacity overall for building the sector. And there's been some questions about, the different types of legal issues or conflicts that arise in both CLT and co-op context, and what we can do to improve those dispute resolution and legal systems, which is something that just given that it is community-based, people, we're all human too, right? So different issues tend to arise when it comes to those conflicts as well. And as Chi kind of pointed out in the chat, there is, a different need for more lawyers and legal firms who truly understand the business of affordable housing. in the affordable housing sector more broadly. And as Fiona mentioned, you know, not affordable housing, you know, 80% of affordable housing is not always affordable for many communities too. And so once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And hopefully we can have more discussion, bring in amazing panelists like you folks to address some of these and unpack some of these key issues. And shout out to Iller Campbell. I know many folks on this space have worked with them too. And so there's many great lawyers that do work in the affordable housing in the capacity.
Amazing. And to the future lawyers like Princess who are on our doorstep raring to go. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to Princess. Thank you to the other members of our organizing group, to Reno Bordelin from the City of Windsor, Ward 3 Councillor and Planning Committee Chair, and James Tischler, Director of Development for the Michigan State Land Bank and visiting fellow with us, coming in and out of the session today, but both of them are very key pieces of this of our organizing team. Please join us next week for and the week after for the last two sessions, one on financial incentives for housing affordability, and then the last one on some planning tools, including pre-zoning. Thanks again to all of our panelists, and we will be following with great excitement the work that you continue to do in this space and be connecting again. I'm sure the video from today will be available, if not tonight, by tomorrow, and on our YouTube channel. So please do feel free to share it and pick up any pieces you might have missed. Thank you again to all of our participants, our attendees, for sticking with us through a long session that I hope is useful. And please stay in touch and let us know what other programming we can provide that's useful to you in the spaces that you are working in on housing and other pieces of the city building framework. Thanks again to everyone.